muscle, we have less. We have more fat, they usually have less. So that accounts for that percentage. We are about 60% water. So where is all this fluid? And we have two main compartments. We have inside the cell, intracellular fluid. That's the fluid inside. And that makes up about 40% of our body weight, the fluid inside the cells. And then outside the cells, we have extracellular fluid. So if it's not in the cell, it's out of the cell, extracellular. And that makes up about 20% of our body weight. So we're 60% water, 40% of it is in the cell, 20% of it is out of the cell. When we're talking about extracellular fluid, what makes up extracellular fluid? Intracellular fluid, ICF, inside the cell, well, we know that. We talked about cytoplasm and cytosol. Outside the fluid, that's our plasma. So we know plasma is that fluid portion up on top of our test tube, is our clear liquid that has all the good stuff in it. So extracellular fluid has plasma in it. It has interstitial fluid. And this is the fluid outside and between the cells. So we're out of the cell, or we're on the outside, extracellular, and this is the fluid that's just between everything on the outside. And we call that interstitial. So intracellular, inside the cell. Interstitial, we're out of the cell, but this is the fluid in between. So your chairs are cells, it's the fluid that would be weaving in between them. So that's interstitial fluid. And then also we have lymph fluid, we have cerebrospinal fluid, we have the synovial fluid in our joints, the part that squirted out the eye when we dissected it, femoral fluid, and our GI secretions. So all the extra stuff we don't think about, extra fluids. So here's our picture of it. We're made up of 60% water, 40% of it is inside the cell, intracellular, and then the other 20% of it is outside the cell, extracellular. And of that extracellular, we have interstitial, the fluid between the cells. Most of the fluid, extracellular, is the fluid going in between your chairs, extracellular fluid. That's the interstitial. And then the other part is all that remaining stuff, the plasma, CSF, synovial fluid. So inside the cells, outside the cells. So let's look at the composition of these fluids. Down here's our chart, here's our picture. So here we are looking at the composition inside the cell and outside the cell. Inside is red and blue, interstitial fluid is so blood. In the composition of blood, we have a lot of sodium outside, because we know sodium lives outside the cell, and we know potassium lives inside the cell. So outside the cell, we have a lot of sodium in the blood and in the interstitial fluid. Not so much inside the cell, and that's how we like it, because we know, here's our cell, potassium lives inside and sodium lives outside, and that's how we like it. Extracellular fluid. So outside the cell, we have our blood and we have our interstitial fluid, high in sodium. Inside the cell, very high in potassium. So we already know that, we've learned that. 10 times greater inside the cell, 10 times greater outside the cell. And what helps balance those out, if we have lots of sodium outside, guess what goes along with it? Chlorine. So sodium chloride, that's what makes the saline solution of our body. That's the other thing that balances that out. And then inside the cell, we have potassium phosphates inside. So those are the things that are kind of binding it up and help regulate it. The yellow stuff is in the cell, red and blue is outside of the cell. And that's what this chart is talking about. So we have the fluids, composition of the fluids. We have electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Water, we know, is a universal solvent, meaning that's the thing that everything's going to be dissolved into. The electrolytes are chemical bonds that are going to dissociate. So they're going to break down into salts, acids, bases, proteins, all the things in our body. Sodium chloride is going to break down into sodium chloride. We saw that in the picture down here. They break down into their own things. Magnesium chloride, they're going to break down These are all the things, the electrolytes, that are going to be floating around in that fluid. And when they dissociate, they start acting on their positive, negative charges. So we get into that whole thing about let's make sure we can buffer all this stuff, because we have positive and negative things going on, and we don't want to get out of balance. So we have to maintain those these electrolytes. And we know that they conduct electrical currents. That's why they're called electrolytes, because they help maintain the current and sends that signal all through our body. So the greater the dissociation, here we go again with chapter 3, the greater the dissociation, the more that's going to affect osmotic pressures and balances, and then we're going to have fluid shifts. So remember, we had our two cells. We had cells that are going to swell and cells that are going to shrink, and that was all about osmotic pressure. Once we start having our electrolytes move, we interrupt homeostasis. And if we get too much movement into cells, osmotic pressure, then we're going to swell. And if we get too much going out, cells are going to shrink. So we have that whole shifting. The reason we have cells swelling and shrinking is because these things are getting out of balance. We need to keep them in homeostasis. And then when we do, we have that normal blood cell that's all happy, and it looks like that. If osmotic pressures get out of balance, and remember osmosis is that selectively permeable membrane, and when that happens, things can start going across. And if they don't go across at the right rate, or they're not balanced, then too much goes in or too much comes out. So examples of that are dehydration. It's a simple thing. We all get dehydrated. We sweat too much for whatever reason. You have a fever, you have the flu, you're walking from building 19 to 20 and then up to building 2. So whatever reason, and we're sweating out fluids, and then those electrolytes get out of balance, and our pressures get out of balance, and cells start shrinking. Or we go the opposite way, where too much goes in, cells start swelling. So it's all about osmosis. Anytime we're moving electrolytes, selectively permeable membrane, osmosis, then we have to worry about this situation. So the greater they're dissociating, the more these things break down, the greater osmotic gets involved, because selectively permeable membrane, and we're going to start seeing fluids shift, and we have to maintain those. So greater osmotic activity leads to the ability to cause fluids to shift across those cells. And water is going to move according to the osmotic gradient. Osmotic gradient goes from low to high osmotic gradients. So once we start dissociating, then everything starts shifting, and water has to keep up with that. Otherwise, we get into swelling or we get into shrinking situations. And because we're being selectively permeable, we're automatically talking about osmosis, and we have to maintain those solutions. If it's not an electrolyte, a non-electrolyte, they're not going to dissociate, their bonds don't break, so we don't have to worry about those. Those aren't going to cause shrinking or swelling, and they're not going to cause a pH shift. So only electrolytes are going to get us into this situation, and they're going to alter pH. If it's non-electrolytes, it's our things that our body can use, like glucose, lipids, creatine, urea, or things that we need to get rid of. But they're not going to break down. They stay in their holes, in their whole pieces, so it doesn't create a problem for us. It's just those electrolytes. They can make cells swell and shrink, or they can make pH get too high or too low. So that's a osmosis thing. And then we get into this situation where we're monitoring. Well, what happens when things start breaking down or dissociating? They're going to break down into their parts, sodium and potassium, so they're going to balance each other out. We're going to stay in homeostasis. If we get too much sodium in, what's also going to come in? Water, and then we're going to end up swelling. Or if too much sodium goes out, water goes out, and we get shrinking. So we have to monitor these once they start splitting out, or bad things are going to happen. Make sense? So composition, extracellular fluid out of the cell, sodium and chlorine are our main things outside. Plasma is neutral, this is hanging out, it's where all the good stuff is, water, glucose, amino acids, etc. Inside the cells can be high in potassium, and that's how we like it. Sodium goes outside, potassium goes inside, and we maintain cell integrity, and we're just waiting for things to happen. So this is our resting membrane potential. When it's time for action, a reaction to happen, that's when we activate that sodium-potassium pump. When sodium comes in and potassium goes out, and then we have that trigger for reactions to happen. But until then, we need to keep it like this. Electrolytes, the sodium-potassium pump, what we were just talking about. How we regulate that is osmotic and hydrostatic pressure are always regulating. Water is going to move freely between these compartments and along the osmotic gradient. Solutes are going to move unequally, and then we get out of balance again. So we have to maintain. Remember, 3 sodiums go in, 2 potassiums go out. That's normal, but when that happens, it creates a spark and things can happen. So we have to make sure we're monitoring that. How we monitor it was with osmotic and hydrostatic pressure. Here's a picture of what we're talking about. So things are going to cross a membrane. What are they going to cross? The lungs. So oxygen is going to leave the lungs, and we're going to go, remember red and blue is extracellular fluid. Oxygen is going to travel across the plasma. It's going to travel through that interstitial fluid between all the cells. And then it's going to go inside the cells. And all the cells are going to have oxygen and they're going to be happy. And then carbon dioxide needs to get out of the cell. It's going to go through the fluid, through the blood, up into the lungs, out the bronchioles, out the trachea, and out the mouth. So we have this flow of things happening across those 2 different membranes, extracellular and intracellular. If it's the digestive system, the nutrients are going to travel through the blood, through the interstitial fluid. They're going to leave the stomach, and now we've got to get it out of the stomach. It goes through the plasma in the blood, goes through the fluid in the cells, and then it goes in the cells, and the cells get nourished. And then water is free to move in and out either direction of the digestive system. And then the kidney is what we just finished talking about. So we're going to have, from the cells, we're going to have water going into the kidneys. We're going to filter it, we're going to process it, and then we're going to turn around and we're going to come back out. So it can go in and it can go out. First we have to deliver it to the kidneys, we have to get it processed. Once it's processed, we're going to return all 98% of what we need back out to the cells. Or we're going to eliminate it, we're going to excrete it out. So this is what we've been talking about all along, not the digestive yet, but we're talking about getting across those membranes, and those membranes, in order to get across, they have to go through those fluids outside the cell, in this area, to get into the cell. Or it has to get out of the cell, intracellular, and we have to eliminate it and send it out through those fluids, the blood, out of the lungs and out of the body. So those are the membranes that we're talking about when we're talking about crossing. How do we get stuff out of the lungs? How do we get stuff out of the digestive system? How do we get stuff out of the urinary system? Because they're traveling across those fluids. How they travel is through the fluids, and that's why it's so important to maintain fluids, so we can have this transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, of nutrients, so we can have filtration, and so we can eliminate waste. So it's traveling across those intra and extracellular barriers. That makes sense? Deep into the physiology. Aren't you glad I'm going on vacation next week? Yay! Exchange of gases, solids, and water. These are occurring across those 3 compartments. The picture we were just looking at, inside the cell or outside the cell. So we're moving across. What's doing that? Remember, hydrostatic pressure is how we push things out of the cell. And it's going to go into those interstitial spaces. And then the fluid is drawn back in through osmotic pressure. So how is it even getting across those membranes back here on this picture? How are we moving fluids? Pressure. The only way we can move something is by pressure, whether that be air or fluids. And the fluids are hydrostatic pressure is pushing it out, and osmotic pressure is pulling it in. And then they're balancing each other out, and then we stay in homeostasis, and we look like this. When we get out of balance, that's when these things start happening. Hydrostatic and osmotic get out of balance. So there's a push in and out. The push out is hydrostatic, the pull in is osmotic. And those are the two pressures that are monitoring how things flow across that. It occurs across the plasma membrane. Permeability is a factor. We know water can flow easily, and then ions are restricted by size and activity. That's where osmosis comes in. We're being selective here. Movement can be unidirectional. We know glucose and oxygen are moving into cells, and then urine and waste products, or urea, carbon dioxide, are moving out of cells. So some things only go in, some things only go out. Some things like water can go in and out. So they go the direction that they're supposed to. What can change these volumes? So we have extracellular outside the fluid, and we have intracellular inside the fluid. So what can change those? What leads to these situations of swelling and shrinking? Extracellular fluid is the solids. The sodium and sodium chloride increases. We have a lot of stuff outside the cell, and it's going to lead to those changes inside. And the flow is going to go from low to high. Water is going to shift. And then cells are going to shrink. When a lot of water is coming out, sodium is going out, so water is coming out, and cells are going to shrink in that situation. Or a lot is going in, and then cells are going to swell in that situation. So which direction are we going? If we get out of balance, if we pull a bunch of sodium out, a bunch of water is going to come out, and cells are going to shrink. Or it's going to go the wrong way, and a bunch of it's going to go in the cell, and water is going to flow in, and we're going to get swollen. So when we do that, again, osmotic and hydrostatic pressure have to keep that balance in check, or we get into the hypotonic solution where cells are swelling, or we get into a hypertonic solution where we're shrinking. So it's all about monitoring what's flowing back and forth across that membrane. And what's flowing is the stuff inside the cell, intracellular, or outside the cell, extracellular. What's outside, sodium and chloride. What's inside, potassium. Things are going to move. That's the way it's supposed to be. Water is always going to flow, but then we're going to get into different situations, and our body has to keep us in homeostasis. And if we get in a severe situation, like the flu, like a fever, we're exercising, we're running, we're sweating, whatever, it can't keep up with that, so we're going to get dehydrated for a little while. But then we can refill, we can put more fluids back up, and electrolytes come back in, we get Gatorade, fluids go up, electrolytes go up, cells pump back up. So it's all about shifting the water and the stuff, the solids and electrolytes across that cell membrane. So the body's always doing this, and we're just not aware of it. It's easy to get into these situations, and then we feel those changes. When we're on our period, we feel like this, right? Cells swell because estrogen comes on board, and estrogen drives the first half of the cycle. And estrogen looks a lot like sodium. And it looks a lot like, or estrogen looks a lot like ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Molecularly, they look very similar. And so ADH says, do not diurese. And estrogen looks a lot like that, so we hold on to fluids. And you'll gain 5 to 8 pounds. And then progesterone comes along, and it drives the second half of the cycle. And it looks a lot like an antidiuretic, and it pushes fluids off. So then we start pushing fluids off when we go back to this again. And then we recycle, we keep going through again and again. But that's how we get into this, is estrogen is one that looks a lot like the hormone that says hold on to fluids. So when estrogen is dominant in the first 15 days of your cycle, you gain water. And then the second half, progesterone, the job of progesterone is maintain pregnancy. And if you're not pregnant, then we push those fluids back off. So up and down, up and down, up and down. Hormones can do that. Water input must equal water output. Sensible water loss is urine, we're just peeing fluids out. And insensible is all the other things that go on, like we're sweating. Hopefully most of the day we're not sweating. Feces, water comes out through that, comes out through respiration, that's called insensible. So the solid concentration and volume of urine loss depends on fluid intake and food intake. If we're eating and drinking a lot, our volumes are going to go up. And if we're not, then our volumes are going to go down. So it depends on what we're putting in our body. So here's a breakdown of where our fluids are. average intake. Most of our fluids comes from our beverages that we're drinking. About 60% of it comes from that. 30% from food, and then metabolizing. And then we output the majority of the output, so volumes in, volumes out. They're maintaining 1,500 mils. So we're taking on fluids, we're feeding on fluids. Foods, in the sense of when we're sweating, feces, things like that. So our balances, our things should be pretty much in balance. If we're taking stuff in, we're putting stuff out. Input and output are balancing. It's thrilling stuff. So how are we monitoring all this? Regulation of input, osmoreceptors, what we've been talking all about. When we're talking about this stuff, the solids, the electrolytes, it's always osmolarity we're talking about when we're selectively permeable. So osmoreceptors up in the hypothalamus are detecting what is going on out there with the fluid, what's going on, what's crossing that plasma membrane. It's looking at stretch receptors and deciding, is the bladder full, is the bladder empty, what's going on out there. So osmoreceptors are watching to see if we're gaining or losing water. Messages get sent to regulate those volumes. And one of the triggers we get is if our volumes get low, we get the thirst mechanism gets triggered. So the hypothalamus, remember in the center of our brain, just below the pituitary, thalamus, hypothalamus, or just above, the hypothalamus is regulating that. It says, well, volumes are not right here. Let's send a signal to you that you are thirsty. And then when that signal is there, you want to drink water. The longer it's there, the more urgent that becomes. So then we're going to take on fluids, and then that's going to shut off that mechanism. It doesn't mean we're rehydrated, but at least we're going in the right direction. So we're putting volumes back in. That's one of the mechanisms of how we regulate that. Dry mouth and decreased volume, what we were just talking about, our mouth gets dry, and it triggers that osmotic pressure. It says, whoa, wait a minute. Everything's getting dehydrated here, and it sends a message for osmotic pressure to start drawing things back into the cells again. So when we do that, we have less saliva because we're trying to hold on to fluids. Osmotic pressure says wherever we can get it, let's draw it back into the cell. So our mouth gets dry, we have less saliva, and then we're drawing that from the blood back in. We're drawing that back into the blood. So it's like osteoporosis. If you're not putting it out, the body says, we still need calcium, we're going to take it no matter what. So it goes and takes calcium from the bone and delivers it to the blood. So we can have muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and immunity. Same thing with this. If we don't have volumes, the body says, well, we need some volume, so we're going to take it wherever we can get it from, and saliva is one of those. It's not a huge producer, but it's something, and it'll go and take it from that. And then your mouth gets really dry. So this is why when we wake up, we have cotton mouth, we're so dry, because we've not been putting fluids in all night, and volumes are getting on. So thirst centers are triggered when volumes drop, when blood pressure drops, and it says drink more fluids. Another thing that's going to regulate volume, obviously ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and water reabsorption. Low ADH in the collecting duct equals water is going to pass on out, and it's not going to be reabsorbed. So remember, ADH is the one that says hold on to. If we need to hold on to fluids, ADH is going to be high, and it's going to say hold on to that fluid, do not let it go. If we're fine, there's not much ADH present. It doesn't come around unless we need it to. So it's just hanging out in the kidneys, staying where it needs to be, and fluids are getting passed out because everything's where it needs to be. When we get low, that's when the trigger for ADH comes on board. So if everything's under homeostasis, there shouldn't be much ADH in our system, and fluids are just going to pass, and we're under homeostasis, and everything's good. If we're getting low in volumes, that's when red light, ADH, go to the rescue. So we've triggered your thirst centers, and we're triggering ADH to get secreted. And when that happens, both of those say hold on to fluids. Questions? Blood pressure, volumes, and ADH. Decreased blood volume and pressure. So if our volumes go down, our pressure is going to go down. Just simple physics. We don't have any fluid, so the pressure is going to drop down. And that triggers ADH. ADH comes on board. blood vessels are directly activated. It's the mechanoreceptors that are going to start vasoconstricting and dilating. They're going to vasoconstrict and say, hold on to fluids. And because the smaller the opening is, the less we're going to let go. We know the other thing is the whole renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, hold on to sodium, hold on to water. So those are all things that are going to try to keep volumes. If we keep volumes, then we can keep pressure to where they need to be. So why would we have a large decrease in blood volume or pressure? What would be happening? What things would lead to that? Hemorrhage, obviously, where this volume are coming out. Burns because you don't have your barrier, and fluid can easily come out. Diarrhea, volumes out. Vomiting, volumes out. Sweating, volumes out. All of those things are things that are going to cause us to lose fluid. So you think about, well, really, how often is this happening? Does this happen very often? Well, it happens on a regular basis, and that we're always on that teeter-totter. But if we get sick and we get a fever, or we have diarrhea, or we have vomiting, or whatever it is, but sweating right now, the humidity is oppressive, right? So we're just sweating, we lose the ability to cool off, so we're just sweating. So it's pretty easy to get into that state pretty quickly when the weather is as hot as it has been. Hopefully we're not dealing with burns and blood loss. We don't have to deal with that. That's a bad situation. But sweating certainly is a factor right now. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever, hopefully we're not dealing with that often, but you're in the medical field, so you're going to be dealing with this stuff often, because these are who your patients are. That's who's coming in to see you. So we're all fine, we're all healthy, but we're not in the hospital. And then when you're in the hospital, those are the kind of things you see. What about hypovolemic shock, anaphylactic shock? What's that all about? So the main idea behind that is extreme vasodilation. So you eat a peanut or get stung by a bee or whatever it is, and your body is hypersensitive to that, and your body says, we need to get this out of our system right now. And it vasodilates to get everything, to flush everything out. It does it in such an extreme way that it vasodilates everywhere, so everything just goes vasodilation, blood pressure drops, blood volumes go down, everything drops down, there's no oxygen to your brain. And so you're passing out, and that's why you can die within minutes, because everything's vasodilated so rapidly that there's no pressure and there's no flow. It's not getting up to your brain and you're not getting oxygen. So how do we treat that? What do we do when somebody goes into anaphylactic shock? What meds do we give them? An epi right now. And then what happens? Extreme vasoconstriction. Blood pressure goes right up, blood pressure goes right up, blood flow goes right up, oxygen goes to the brain, and then you're coming right back. So that's what low volume shock is that's an anaphylactic shock situation. It could be extreme loss of blood, whatever, if you're having like an extreme fluid, a burn unit or something like that, they can go into that, but that's what happens. That's the mechanism behind anaphylactic shock, is it's low volumes. When it drops, oxygen drops with it, and the brain's not getting more in.
So like during the code and stuff, patients still receive epinephrine if it's not allergy related.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Or you're shocking them, depending what the reason is for.
Normally it's both. I mean, the few codes that I have been on, it's normally both.
Yeah, because they're like, we're losing the pressure's dropping. Yeah. So then somebody amps of epi, or somebody knows of epi, and somebody amps of shock. You know. So when things go wrong, they just hurry up and go wrong, and you just hurry up and get everything back on. Okay, makes sense? So what triggers ADH? That's what we're just talking about. If our volumes drop, what's measuring that are the baroreceptors. Remember, we have those in our carotid arteries. We have our stretch receptors in there. So our baroreceptors are monitoring volumes dropping. Our osmoreceptors, that's the solute. We're looking at this situation up here. They're monitoring that. They're triggering the pituitary. It's going to trigger ADH. It's going to trigger thirst centers. We're going to trigger the kidneys, renin, angiotensin. And all of those are things we're going to do to get volumes and pressures back up. So first, we're monitoring our fluids. And when we start to see things drop, we have our different receptors, stretch receptors, and solid receptors. And we're going to trigger, things are dropping. Let's do what we can. First, let's make you thirsty. Start drinking, get things back up again. Let's talk to ADH. Let's get that on board. Let's start conserving volume. Let's talk to the kidneys. Let's get that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone thing going. So these are all mechanisms we're going to do to hold on to fluids and bring volumes back up. And then we come back into homeostasis. So just like in the kidney chapter, because the kidneys are all about fluids. Question? Thrilling stuff. Hypertonic solutions. In a hypotonic solution, we are overhydrated, so cells are swelling, and we have decreased extracellular fluid. Sodium is normally there, but there's so much water that we're becoming so dilute. So sodium's normal, but we have increased water intake so much it's dilute, so it appears that sodium is not there, or it is acting as though it's not there, because it's getting too diluted, it's not effective enough. So ADH is inhibited in that situation. We need to push the water out. Hyponatremia is the sodium. Water goes into the cell and they swell from overhydration. So that's a bad situation. We get into hydration, overhydration situations. You get nausea, you get vomiting, cramping, swelling on the brain, disoriented because we're putting too much pressure on everything. So we're just getting confused, we're getting disoriented, and that's just a bad situation. So we got to get a bunch of saline solution on board. We're going to put a bag, we're going to put wine in, hang a bag, and we're going to put a bunch of saline in there, and we want to pull all that excess water off of it. So we're trying to get that out as soon as possible. As volumes go up, pressure goes up, everything gets at a dangerous level. So we can't have those situations. Overhydration is possible. And here's the picture of your book. Here's your cell. If we put the tap on, if we open it, water's going to come out, excessive water loss, water's going to come out, and cells are going to shrink. Or if we turn on the faucet and dump it into the cells are going to swell. So that's your picture of dehydration and swelling as these pictures right here. So we need fluid to come in. We need fluids to cross this membrane, but we need it to be at an even rate. We need osmotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure to be working. Fluids go in, fluids go out. Stuff goes in, stuff goes out. If that's the case, then we stay in homeostasis. But if we get out of balance, it's like leaving the faucet open and everything's going to come out and cells are going to shrink up. Or if we leave the faucet wide open and we dump it into the cell, there's only so much they can take, and cells are going to swell. So we're out of that normal balance of hydrostatic and osmotic pressure. One's drawing, in this situation we're drawing too much out, hydrostatic pressure, and in this situation we're drawing too much in, osmotic pressure. They have to be equal. If one says push off, push off, push off, hydrostatic pressure, get out, get out, get out, we're going to shrink. And if osmotic pressure says come on in,